You know when your customers are shopping at your business and they pick up a product? The customer holds it, feels it, and shows it to their friend. Then they look at the price tag.
Oh my, I need to look at something else.
The customer picks up a second item and loves the way it looks. They've heard of this product, but haven't yet seen it in person.
I've got to have this.
You're happy the customer chose to buy a product, but you're equally frustrated that they didn't buy both items.
I want them both.
The Consumer Experience Lab at Barbera Solutions designs behavioral strategies that target the consumer's decision-making process. BarberaSolutions.com. Because the opposite of rational is not irrational. BARBERA Solutions.com. Why is the shopping cart always in the top right of the screen?
How do companies predict my purchases?
Why do prices end in 9?
Why do fast food companies use red and yellow in their logos?
Why do restaurants always have one expensive menu item?
Researchers, marketers, and very curious people seek the answers for how we make decisions and how we choose products. Clicksuasion finds the secrets that companies use and shares them with you.
Why do I feel better when I bought the last remaining airline ticket?
How do I make choices based on colors and fonts?
Welcome to Clicksuasion. This is your host, Michael Barbera. We're here today with Philip Graves. Philip is a consumer behavior consultant, author, speaker, and regular contributor to the media. He has been described as one of the world's leading consumer behavior experts and one of the world's preeminent consumer behavior consultants, original thinkers, and whose ideas will help shape Britain's recovery. For the last 6 years, he has been working with international businesses, providing expert advice on consumer behavior and behavioral insight. His first book, Consumer.ology, was published in 2010 and was named one of Amazon's top 10 business books of the year. In addition to case studies and examples from his own work, the book draws on some of the latest academic research from psychology, neuroscience, to show why most market research can't work and what companies should be doing instead. Consumer.ology has been described as an essential reading for marketers and general managers, and accessible and thought-provoking for non-business audiences. Alongside his own consumer behavior consultancy, work for clients including the media, retailers, and financial services, Philip is an associate of Frontier Economics. In addition to the articles on Philip's website, Philip writes a column for the Chartered Institute of Marketing's magazine, The Marketer, and also writes about consumer behavior for Psychology Today. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. So, since I built you all up and made you sound awesome, and you are, because your book is really good, and you do provide a good practitioner's guide for what to do and what not to do. Tell us, what does all that mean? Tell us more about yourself in your own words.
I suppose what it comes down to is that through practical experience, I realized I needed to understand the consumer's unconscious mind. And so the vast majority of my work stems from and reflects the fact that we as creatures are, to a large degree, operating without a good sense of why we're doing things. And I think, if you're interested in marketing, if you're looking to connect with consumers, most businesses would say, we want to understand consumers. Sometimes they talk about the voice of the consumer, although it's not a phrase I like. Then you need to understand the consumer's unconscious mind. And that's where I spend most of my time looking and thinking.
How do you feel we can target the consumer's unconscious mind if we or they don't really know what irrational thoughts they may be thinking?
I guess there are a couple of thoughts in there. I'm going to dive straight in and correct the word irrational. I know technically it's used in behavioral economics. It's really not a helpful word to focus on, and I would always encourage people to avoid words like irrational and bias. But to answer your question, it really comes down to appreciating what you shouldn't do. So if you accept the evidence, and I would say that it's overwhelming, that human behavior is driven to a large degree by the unconscious mind. And, we could quibble over the percentages, but I've heard 95% of behavior being driven by the unconscious, and I wouldn't argue with that figure. Then that means there are some things you really need to avoid doing if you're not going to be misled in your decision making. And chief amongst that is asking consumers what they think and believing that what they tell you is true.
Why do you feel that irrational and bias are not helpful words?
Well, in day-to-day speech, they have a certain meaning, a certain connotation. Irrational suggests that what someone's doing is not in their best interests in common parlance. And typically when we're operating from the unconscious mind, we're using mechanisms that have evolved over tens of thousands of years precisely because they do work most of the time. They're cognitively efficient. That's why we think in the way that we do. That's why we have these kind of default programs in our mind, these faster ways of doing things. And bias, technically, yeah, I understand it. It's right. It's a bias from the rational. However, again, it has a pejorative tone to it. It suggests that there is something fundamentally wrong with it, and it's the same issue. Actually, the traits that we have in the unconscious mind reflect ways of doing things that broadly work out very well for us, both in evolutionary terms and in our day-to-day lives.
Would you say that you're biased against the word bias?
I wouldn't say I'm biased against the word bias necessarily. I would just say that I think it's, language is really important, and quite often when I'm trying to think of the best way of describing it. New movements, new approaches come along, and we've seen this over the years with different aspects of psychoanalysis which have been popularized. Now we're seeing behavioral economics popularized, and what happens is they quite often get simplified heuristically into kind of a number of buzzwords that people throw around and think they know what they mean by them. So I think if we're going to have the buzzwords, and if we're going to simplify, which we will because we're human beings and that's what we do, then we ought to get the right ones.
So you mentioned a good buzzword there, simplify. When consumers frame messages or let me rephrase that, when marketers frame messages to consumers, how important is it to simplify the consumer's choice, and why?
It depends. And it depends is the answer that I will give every time you ask me a question of that kind, because from a human point of view, context is everything. Human psychology point of view, context is everything. And there are situations where having more choice will be helpful, and there are situations where having less choice will be helpful. And choice is also, choice isn't just choice, it's choice density as well as number of options. So by and large, is simplification a good thing? Yes, probably. And the reason it's a good thing, generally speaking, is that when consumers find things difficult, they are likely to misattribute the difficulty of the process they find themselves in, so the difficulty of choosing, with the target of their consumer activity. So they will think the thing that they're looking at is less good because they're finding it harder to want it. And one of the reasons they may be finding it harder to want is because of the number of similar options that are around what they're looking at. And I've certainly seen that evidenced in even things like television programs. As the number of television programs has increased dramatically over the course of my lifetime, there is quite often a comment that the quality has declined. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. I think as often it's the fact that there are several things on that are equal in quality, and the natural response to that is to find none of them compelling. So yeah, simplifying and giving consumers ways of managing choice can be really important for that reason.
So let's talk about options. With television shows, there's a plethora of television stations and channels, and each have a plethora of choices to choose from. There's also on-demand streaming services. So there's a lot of choices there for consumers on what to watch and how to be entertained. If you go to the supermarket and go down the cereal aisle, you're probably going to have a similar cognitively taxing experience trying to pick a cereal box, unless you go with the one you normally go with. But then if you go to that same grocery store and you go to, say, the milk aisle, where there's only a few different brands of milk, this is a loaded question, and it's going to change a lot by industry. So how many options are too many options, and how could managers or marketers kind of decide on what is too much and what is the right amount of options for the consumer?
It's the only answer to that question is you need to be mindful of the problems that you can cause by having the demands, cognitively speaking, of excessive choice, and then with that in mind, decide whether or not reducing choice is something that would be a good target for experimentation for conducting live trials. So I'll give you a really good example of the risks involved in this. One of the big supermarkets had seen the success of newer supermarkets, the discount supermarkets that had come along with a smaller footprint, offering much, much less choice in any given category of consumer goods, and taken the decision, well, we should do the same thing. You know, it's working for them. They're offering less choice. We read all this stuff about the psychology of choice, so we should reduce our range. And the result was it hit their sales really hard because people were used to being able to go to that big supermarket and find the things that they wanted. And in rationalizing the ranges, that meant that almost every shopper who went there had lost something that previously they had gone and wanted to buy. Now, in that situation, you have an environment where people have developed a lot of cognitive shortcuts to make purchase decisions, and by removing the brands that they regularly buy without a second's thought, they're making instant brand-related decisions. If you remove those brands, what do they have to do? They have to think. So you make the shopping experience more cognitively demanding, not less, in that situation. So when it comes to it, yes, simplifying choice can be a very important thing to think about, certainly making the buying process generally as simple as you can make it is important, but in any context, you've got to be prepared to conduct trials to see what the impact will be, and not just take a kind of a general received piece of wisdom from behavioral psychology and think, okay, we can do that in our business and things will work better.
So I know you're an advocate of data collection. How can marketers collect data without directly asking the consumer, what they want?
By and large, they should never ask the consumer what they want. And I think to turn that question around, if I said to, as I have done to organizations around the world, and say, okay, imagine that you cannot ask consumers questions. It's been outlawed by some right-thinking regulatory body. What would you do instead? And very quickly, you will get to a whole raft of very good answers. You might watch what they do. You might pay more attention to the sales data that you've got. You might try and collect footfall data. You might try and collect video data showing what people are doing and aggregate that. You might change something and see what the impact is on the sales that you get as a result, rather than asking people if they think it would be a good idea if you change that thing. And all of those alternatives I've just suggested are infinitely better than asking people what they think as a guide to what they'll do in the future in response to something new. So, there are lots of ways of measuring behavior, observing behavior, of capturing behavior that are really powerful tools, and without the distraction of asking people what they think and being misled by that as a data point, you will probably get much further much more quickly using alternative approaches.
How could marketers use the current data they already have?
Well, there's an important need to reframe the way you think about any commercial challenge that you have as an organization. So what historically we've been lulled into doing is using consumer opinion as a sort of a horoscope-like tool, as a bit of futurology, that despite the fact that anything that's ever purported to see into the future has been proven to be pretty poor at it, we're still quite often people believe in the idea that that asking people questions is a good way of seeing into the future, which makes no sense at all. So what we need to separate out is the stages that are involved in any business change. And that's what we're generally talking about when we're talking about marketing. We're talking about some degree of behavior change. It might be simply we want more people to buy our products. We want the same people to buy more of our products, or we want people to like us better when they use our service. Why? So they'll come back more often or whatever. So the first part is to recognize that what you can do, and what you can do really well, and most organizations don't, is understand now. Because what has just happened is the real sweet spot for consumer insight. And that's where I spend the vast majority of my time. Now, that might be through looking at behavioral data. It might be through observing people when they're shopping. And it might even be through asking questions, although I do that in a very particular way that removes people's ability to post-rationalize what they're doing and gets me to see inside their minds. Essentially, I'm psychoanalyzing the behavioral decisions that they have just taken, because what we're doing is we're understanding a fact, we're understanding something that's happened, and we can then dig into it, and using both what we know about the way that people make decisions and clues that we can pick up along the way, we can really understand what's going on. And that then gives you the best possible foundation for your creative next step. But what you must recognize is that that is a creative next step. So you might perfectly understand that, and I'll simplify, a very simple scenario. Let's say you realize that consumers are confused when they're in your store. You see them prevaricating and moving around, and quite often they'll leave without buying anything, although you're pretty sure they have a need for this product. And so you think, okay, we need to make this an easier purchase experience. And of course, it doesn't tell you how to make it an easier purchase experience. And trust me on this, consumers can't tell you how to make it an easier purchase experience either. They'll give you answers to questions you ask them, but they won't know until you turn it into an experience whether or not that ends up being easier or more difficult. So then you get to the creative stage. You've identified what you want to change. You've identified the sort of psychological target. You want to reduce the cognitive effort that's required to purchase this product. You're going to come up with a number of different options. Now, one of them may present itself as being very compelling, in which case, great. Off you go with that. But it might be that there are two or three. It might be that there's a communication route, there's a physical layout route, there's a restocking route, whatever. And then the question is, well, okay, how easily can you try these things? How can you experiment? What are your options to put these into place and see how consumers really behave when you change them? And ultimately, if you look at the businesses that have been most successful over the last couple of decades, the thing that they have in common is the ability to conduct trials and to learn. Now, most of those businesses, not all of them, have been technology companies because the platform lends itself to that kind of approach. But any business can make itself more lean and more experimentally efficient if it realizes that that's where the real value of insight lies.
So when the organization wants to go through that creative process, how many, say, measurable constructs are too many to change at one time, or too many to track what the consumer's next behavior is?
It depends. It depends very much what you're working with, and sometimes you have to factor in pragmatically your capacity to conduct experiments. Now, in certain contexts and certain areas that I've worked in, you can change lots of things. Maybe you're sending out a mailer and you can send out 1,000 different mailers to 10,000 to 100,000 people, and you can test lots of different permutations and combinations, and that's beautiful. And at the end of that, you can build up a pretty strong sense of how each element when it's working with another element, is working to bring about a particular outcome. But in most cases, organizations are nowhere near that. They find it incredibly difficult to run one pilot very often. So the pragmatic requirement is to work out where you can test and balance up the opportunity to test lots of things easily with the opportunity to test more complex things in a more challenging way. And for any individual business, part of the task is to work out where that sweet spot is for experimentation.
Now, reviewing those metrics, we'll come up with statistics. And of course, they're beneficial to the organization. And they're also very beneficial to marketing. How does statistics apply to framed messages for the consumer? Say, for example, 64% of people love this product. 91% of people will use this at home. 75% of people who came to this store today bought this product. What are your thoughts on using numbers and statistics to persuade the consumer?
It's a perfectly valid approach to use. It can work very well. What it's essentially doing is delivering what feels like it's delivering a sort of a dual effect. It's delivering some numerology, some sense of precision, because what you're doing is quoting a statistic, and that feels implicitly as though there must have been some measurement behind it. Quite often it's completely nonsense, but if it's a figure you feel you can run with, that's not stopped organizations in the past from running it from their small samples and statistically invalid and experimentally poor tests. So you get that benefit of implied numerology. And you also are typically delivering some social proof. What you're saying is that other people have approved this, other people have enjoyed it, other people have liked it, and that can be a very compelling mechanism for human beings, because we're social creatures. We're constantly factoring in what other people around us are doing for two reasons. One, because it tells us what's safe, and two, because it tells us what we need to be doing if we're going to fit in with our tribe. And both of those things have been bred into the way we think and make decisions over thousands of years.
Philip, I want to talk about you for a moment. So why did you choose, or how did you become interested into behavioral science?
I absolutely tripped, stumbled, and fell into behavioral science. So I studied statistics. That was my degree. I then went into market research and was a market research manager at a financial services company. And relatively quickly, I was curious as to why market research was so unsatisfactory. Why was it that people with decades of operational experience found it hard to accept what consumers were saying in research and what was being reported back through the work I was doing? And why was it that whenever I could cross-check anything that we were getting from consumer surveys with real data, real behavioral data, I couldn't line it up? And that was intriguing and fascinating to me. And about the same sort of time, I read a book on psychoanalysis, one of the best books I've ever read, called Counseling for Toads, by a guy called Robert DeBoard. And in the book, he takes the characters from Wind in the Willows and Toad from Wind in the Willows, and he takes them through a psychoanalytical experience using transactional analysis. And it dawned on me that within consumer research, we were typically allowing people to express things entirely at face value, as though there was no depth to that decision, as though they had perfect visibility of their own decision-making frameworks. When for things outside of the consumer world, like their relationships or stress or eating or whatever else, other issues they were facing, psychoanalysis didn't think for a minute that people could understand themselves and that they would, just ask them a couple of questions and report back what they said, and they'd go away and go, that's fantastic, my stress is lifted, I now understand the world perfectly, because in such a world there would be no place for psychoanalysis. So then I studied psychoanalysis. That led me into psychology, and particularly behavioral psychology. And throughout my professional interest in understanding consumers, which was my job, was being constantly challenged by the things that I was seeing, in these parallel disciplines. And in the end, I started to become deeply skeptical of pretty much every piece of research I encountered. And that led me to do the research for the book, when I essentially was asking the question, what is the evidence that asking people what they think is a good way of understanding them? And as deep as I digged and as far as I went, I couldn't find any evidence to support that assertion. And I found heaps of evidence to suggest that there's just no support for it.
That's a very long trip.
It is a long trip, yeah. I mean, at the time, I would love to be the sort of person who could have embarked on it with some sense of direction and some sense of a goal and a mission. That certainly wasn't how it happened. It was, random happenstance and serendipity, if you choose to see it that way, of reading a particular book, being in a particular environment, getting the reactions of people to projects, being tuned into that. And I think probably the bit which, and I can't even really take credit for this, is a somewhat, some would say cynical, I would say skeptical nature, which I think was as a result of my upbringing and my father. That means that I tend not to be someone who by nature follows rules for rules' sake, and instead tends to question them.
So I had to ask that question, because a lot of us are the same way. I didn't, grow up and be like, I want to be a behavioral economist when I grow up. I didn't know what BE was. I probably didn't know what it was 10 years ago, but somehow matured myself into it. And it's nice to hear that there's others that have this similar stories, and just one step at a time through academia or experiences that find their way into behavioral science.
Well, quite an amusing anecdote that very much emphasizes that point. Excuse me. When the book was published, I was very excited about it. It was a surprise in many ways that I got it published relatively quickly, and but again, I was just kind of watching the world go by, thinking this is great fun. And I received an email from somebody called Paul Dolan, who said, I'd like to meet you. I'd like you to come along and have a cup of coffee, and I'd like to talk to you. And it turned out that this was the professor of behavioral economics from the London School of Economics, and someone who'd worked and studied under Daniel Kahneman. And, I was thinking, this is probably not going to go very well. I'm going to go into this guy's office and he's going to tear me apart because this is his world. And I've just basically kind of fallen into it accidentally. And, and I walked along feeling like a naughty schoolboy going to the headmaster's office. And Paul is the least professorial type of character you could ever meet. It would be the last thing you thought he did for a living if you ever met him. And I walked into his room. He had my book on the table. He picked it up and he said, "Okay, you're right. What are we going to do about it?" And what I realized at that point was that the behavioral economists, and I've now met and worked with quite a few, who'd come at it from an academic point of view, had essentially just kind of run past the world of commercial market research, and in many ways I think just dismissed it as an irrelevancy. I think Dan Ariely had talked about it in passing in a couple of things he'd written about, but it really was, to all intents and purposes, an irrelevant distraction to them, because they knew that what mattered were behavioral experiments, and they were just getting on with their behavioral experiments. And I was really, to my knowledge, one of the first people to really put attention on the fact that we're spending billions around the world on asking people what they think. And it frankly is bordering on the insane, given the evidence that we've got that, there's no justification for it. Now, I understand psychologically why we do it, but, for anyone wanting to do their job well, don't take my word for it. Do the investigation yourself, and I guarantee you'll reach the same conclusion.
Do it yourself and break the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And just challenge the challenge the hypothesis that everyone's working under. There's a quote from, I think, Mark Twain, and I'm not going to do it justice, but it runs to the effect of, mostly what people do is they take other people's opinions and run with them, and just because they've heard them a lot, and that actually those opinions aren't worth anything when you stand back and scrutinize them. And he says it much more prosaically than that, but that is what it comes down to. Where is our evidence for a lot of the things we do? And of course, we don't have any. We're doing it because as human beings, we've evolved with the capacity for belief, and it's much quicker to accept things than to work them out from first principles. But that does leave us open to looking quite foolish sometimes. We did it with the Earth as the center of the universe. We've done it with various things through history. And we do occasionally catch ourselves out by falling for stuff that really there's no evidence for.
Philip, what is next for you? What is Philip's futurology?
Well, I'm always very wary of expert predictions, and I'd extend that to my own life and career. It's a really difficult question to answer. I'm very fortunate that I get involved in lots of really interesting work. I'm very busy with the work that I do. Because of the way that I approach my work, I'm not tied into one sector. So, this week I am working on dietitians and nutrition. I'm working on premium spirits. I'm working on problems that utility companies face with people flushing wet wipes down their toilets. I'm working on television programs. Yesterday, I was doing an interview on national radio in the UK talking about consumer issues and suppliers changing to all British meat for supermarkets. And, my world is full of speaking engagements, working with different categories. It's incredibly diverse, but it's not particularly planned, and it doesn't really lend itself to being planned because it's very much demand driven. And I'm lucky to work in all these areas. And at the moment, I'm so busy working on all of them that what I did 7-8 years ago when I sat back and wrote the book came about by virtue of having a little bit more space in my life than I do now. I really do intend to write a second book. It's previewed in the back of the 2013 edition of Consumer.ology, but it's very hard to justify spending that time writing the next book because books are not the most lucrative thing in the world, and consultancy and public speaking probably are quite high up there as being lucrative things. And so as someone who has a very high drive for efficiency, which I think is another part of why the behavioral approach interests me, I'm enjoying the diversity of projects and the application of behavioral psychology to the work that I do at the moment, and taking these things as they come.
You mentioned that you're lucky to be in this field. We're lucky to have your contributions to behavioral science, to consumer psychology, BI, BE, BF, etc. And so we thank you. And if any of the listeners want to get in contact with you, how could they?
I would say the best place to go first is my website, which is www.philipgraves.net. Philip Graves, all one word, just one L. And there you can find contact details for me there, and read more about some of my thoughts on consumer issues and similar topics.
Philip, thanks so much for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. To the listeners, go buy Philip's book, Consumer.ology. It's an easy read. It's fun. It's provocative. You'll definitely find at least one tidbit in that book that you can apply to your business model or to your daily lives. Philip, again, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Clicksuasion. Subscribe to the podcast, read our research, and get in touch with us at Clicksuasion.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @Clicksuasion.
You always want to look your best, but you don't always have time to deal with a necktie that won't cooperate. That's where we come in. Introducing the Never Tie, the only necktie that you never have to tie. Each Never Tie comes with a tie and 2 removable knots that you simply slide on and adjust for your comfort, giving you the perfect look every time. Choose from over 20 stylish designs at thenevertie.com.